He thought he was being generous. That was the part that stayed with Nathan long after everything else had settled. The way Gerald Whitmore had smiled when he offered the chance. Like he was doing the world a favor. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the sky over Toronto sits low and gray and refuses to commit to anything. The Whitmore industrial facility on the eastern edge of the Port Lands was already buzzing by 7. 3 shifts of workers, a fleet of automated sorting machines, and one very expensive conveyor integration system that had been dead for 11 days. 11 days. Gerald Whitmore, the man whose name was on the building, whose grandfather had started the company sorting scrap metal by hand in 1961, whose face appeared on the cover of Canadian Business twice in the last decade, was not a man accustomed to waiting 11 days for anything. He had called in his own maintenance team first, then a firm from Mississauga, then 2 separate contractors from out of province. He had flown in a specialist from Germany who spoke very little English and charged $900 an hour and left after 3 days without solving anything. 43 technicians in total. The system was still down. The losses were not small. Every day the line sat silent, cost the company somewhere north of $80,000 in delayed contracts and overtime rerouting. Gerald's operations manager, a sharp, humorless man named Stuart Falk, had started sleeping at the facility. The engineers who came and went spoke in careful, hedging language. Possible fault cascade, integration anomaly, legacy software conflict. Words that meant, when stripped of their professional coding, that nobody knew what was wrong. Nathan Osei had been sleeping in his car for 6 weeks. He was 34. Before that, he had been renting a room in a house in Scarborough with 2 other men, until the landlord sold the property to a developer and gave them all 40 days' notice. Before that, he had been working as a systems integration technician for a mid-sized logistics firm in Brampton, until the company restructured and eliminated his entire department in a single Friday afternoon email. Before that, he had spent 8 years building an expertise that was, in the specific and frustrating way that expertise sometimes is, almost completely invisible from the outside. He did not look like someone who knew things. He was aware of this. He wore the same rotation of 3 hoodies, carried a backpack that was starting to split at one strap, and had the particular quietness of someone who had stopped expecting to be asked for their opinion. He had been parking his car, a 2009 Civic with a rusting rear panel, in the lot behind a Tim Hortons near the Port Lands, because the lot didn't have overnight restrictions and staff had never asked him to leave. He ate there most mornings. He had been watching the Whitmore facility for days, not out of any plan, just because it was visible from where he sat, and because he was the kind of person who, when faced with idleness, watched machines. He noticed the conveyor had stopped moving on the 2nd day. He noticed the parade of vans and contractor vehicles arriving and leaving over the following week. He noticed the way the loading dock sat empty each morning, when it should have been busy by 6. On the 8th day, he walked to the perimeter fence with his coffee and stood there long enough to see the integrated sorting arm on the East Bay, hanging at an angle it should not have been able to achieve. He knew then, or he had a very strong idea. It was the kind of fault that looked like a hardware problem but wasn't. It was a synchronization issue. A conflict between the legacy PLC firmware and a software patch that had almost certainly been pushed automatically during a routine overnight update, clipping a handshake protocol that the newer and older systems needed to run in parallel. He had seen it once before, at a distribution center in Hamilton. It had taken that facility's team 3 weeks and a hardware replacement they didn't need before someone had finally suggested looking at the firmware version log. He stood at the fence and thought about this for a while. He was not sure what made him do what he did next. Later, he would say it was the arm, the way it hung there, slightly wrong, in a building that had clearly been built by someone who cared about doing things right. It seemed like a waste. He went to the front entrance and asked to speak with whoever was managing the repair effort. The woman at the reception desk looked at him the way people sometimes looked at him. A quick assessment, starting at the backpack, moving to the hoodie, landing somewhere around the split strap, and told him to have a seat. He sat for 40 minutes. Then a young man in a Whitmore polo came out and told him, not unkindly, that the facility was not currently accepting unsolicited service inquiries. "I'm not selling anything," Nathan said. "I think I know what's wrong with your conveyor system." The young man smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "We have people working on that." "I know. I've seen them coming and going for over a week." He paused. "The East Bay sorting arm is hanging at about 12 degrees off its resting axis. That's not a motor fault. That's a firmware handshake failure between your legacy PLC and whatever patch your system pulled in the last 2 weeks." The young man's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "I'll pass that along," he said. Nathan gave him his name and the number of a prepaid phone he'd bought at a shopper's the previous month, and walked back to his car. He did not expect to hear from them. He made himself another coffee in the Tim Hortons and ate a breakfast sandwich and watched the gray water in the channel catch the thin October light. His phone rang at 4:17 that afternoon. It was Stuart Falk. His voice was flat and efficient, the voice of a man who had been dealing with a problem for 11 days and was now running low on both options and patience. He said he'd relayed Nathan's observation to their current contractor, who had dismissed it. He said Gerald Whitmore had heard about it anyway, and wanted to know if Nathan could come in and explain himself. Nathan said yes. He drove home, which is to say, he drove to the Tim Hortons lot and changed into the cleanest shirt he had, a blue Oxford that was slightly too big in the shoulders, and drove back to the Whitmore facility. Gerald Whitmore met him in the operations bay. He was a tall man, early 60s, with the easy confidence of someone who had never had to wonder if he belonged in a room. He was wearing what Nathan would later describe as a very expensive version of casual. Dark trousers, a merino sweater, shoes that had no business being on a factory floor. He looked at Nathan with the particular expressions of a man who has been told something unlikely and has not yet decided whether to be amused or annoyed. There were 4 other people in the room. Stuart Falk, 2 technicians from the current contractor, a firm called Meridian Systems, whose lead engineer, a man named Claude Perreault, had a manner that Nathan recognized immediately. The particular bristling that happens when someone feels their territory is being entered without invitation. "So," Gerald said. He gestured loosely at the bay. "You have a theory." "I do. Our team has been over this system for the better part of 2 weeks." "I know." Gerald tilted his head slightly. "And you're what, exactly? Who do you work for?" "Currently, nobody." Gerald glanced at Stuart, then back at Nathan. "Where are you coming from?" "The Tim Hortons across the channel." There was a beat of silence. Claude Perreault made a sound that was not quite a laugh. One of the other technicians looked at the floor. Gerald, to his credit, kept his expression neutral. "All right," he said. "What's your theory?" Nathan explained it. He used precise language because precision was the only thing he had to offer, and he knew it. He talked about the PLC firmware version, the patch release window, the specific handshake protocol that would have been clipped by the update, the way the fault would cascade to appear mechanical when it wasn't. He talked for about 4 minutes without stopping. He watched Gerald's face while he talked, and Gerald's face was, for those 4 minutes, entirely unreadable. When Nathan finished, Claude Perriot stepped forward. He was a heavy-set man with a close-trimmed beard, and the kind of credentials that come laminated. He had been in the industry for 22 years, had certifications from 4 separate bodies, and had, he now mentioned, reviewed the firmware logs himself 2 days earlier. The logs were clean, he said. No patch conflict registered. The patch wouldn't show as a conflict in a standard log review, Nathan said. It would read as a successful update. You'd have to pull the handshake sequence data from the integration buffer separately. It's stored in a partition that the standard diagnostic doesn't query. Claude's jaw tightened. I know what partition it's stored in. Then you'd have seen it. I told you, the logs were clean. There was a silence that had a specific texture to it. Gerald was looking at Nathan. Stuart was looking at Gerald. Claude was looking at Nathan, with an expression that had stopped being professional. Look, Claude said, and his voice had dropped a register in the way that voices sometimes do when a person decides to stop performing patience. I don't know where you're coming from or who told you about this facility, but this is a complex integration system with custom architecture. It's not something you diagnose from a parking lot. He paused. Or wherever you've been sleeping. The room went very still. Nathan did not react. He had learned, over years that had included a number of rooms like this one, to let things like that pass through him without catching. He looked at Gerald instead. Gerald was looking at Claude. His expression had changed. It was a small change, the kind that most people would miss, but Nathan had spent enough time reading rooms to see it. Claude, Gerald said quietly, that's enough. Claude seemed to realize, slightly too late, that he had miscalculated. He straightened. I'm just saying. I heard what you were saying. Gerald looked at Nathan for a long moment. Then he said, show me. They walked to the East Bay. Nathan asked for access to the integration terminal. The technician who unlocked it looked at Claude first, a habit. Claude gave a slight nod that seemed to cost him something. Nathan sat down. The terminal was exactly the system he expected, a version he had worked with in 2 previous facilities. He navigated to the partition, found the handshake log, and pulled the sequence data. It took him 6 minutes. The conflict was there, exactly where he said it would be. The room was quiet in a different way now. Nathan walked them through it. He showed them the patch timestamp, the clipped sequence, the cascade effect that had thrown the sorting arm off its calibration and triggered a fault mode the system had never been designed to display cleanly. He showed them how to roll back the specific element of the patch without losing the rest of the update. He walked one of the Meridian technicians through the reset sequence, step by step. The conveyor system came back online at 9:44 that evening. Gerald Whitmore stood at the edge of the bay and watched the sorting arm return to its correct position, with the expression of a man watching something he had started to believe might not be possible. The line moved. The arms sequenced. The East Bay, silent for 11 days, resumed exactly as it had been built to do. He turned to Nathan. What do you charge? He said. Nathan thought about this for a moment. He was aware that this was the moment. He had spent 6 weeks sleeping in a Civic and eating breakfast sandwiches and watching the channel. And this was the moment, and he was not going to undervalue it because the room expected him to. He named a consulting fee. It was not a small number. Gerald did not flinch. He looked at Nathan with something that had taken a while to arrive but was now clearly respect. Done, he said, and I want a direct number for you, not the company, not an agency, you. Nathan gave him the prepaid number. He would buy a real phone the following week. Stuart drew up a same-day consulting invoice at Nathan's number, processed it through their emergency contractor system, and arranged a direct deposit. He also, with a quietness that said more than volume would have, informed Claude Perrault that Meridian's contract would not be renewed. Claude left without speaking to Nathan again. Nathan didn't expect him to. What happened in the following weeks happened gradually and then quickly, which is usually how things happen when they happen. Gerald mentioned Nathan to 2 people. One of those people mentioned him to 3 others. By December, Nathan had signed short-term consulting agreements with 4 separate logistics and manufacturing facilities across the GTA. By January, he had incorporated. By spring, he was hiring. He did not forget the parking lot. He kept the prepaid phone in the top drawer of the desk in his new office, a modest space on the 2nd floor of a building in Etobicoke. Nothing flashy. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what he'd known when no one had asked him, of the months when the knowing hadn't mattered yet. He also never forgot what Claude had said. Not with bitterness, exactly. More the way you keep a stone in your pocket. Something with weight that occasionally reminds you it's there. There is a question that tends to follow this kind of story, and it is this. If you had been standing in that inspirations bay, watching a man in a too big shirt and a splitting backpack sit down at that terminal, would you have handed him the access card before you knew how it ended? When it still looked like a long shot, or a joke, or a man with nothing left to lose, trying something that probably wouldn't work. Think about that honestly. Because somewhere right now, there is someone who knows exactly what's wrong, and they are waiting at the fence. I keep thinking about the fence. Not the building, not the terminal, not even the moment the conveyor came back online. Just the fence, and a man standing outside it with a coffee cup, watching something broken that no one with a badge and a credential had been able to fix. There's something about that image that I can't let go of, because Nathan didn't climb the fence. He didn't force anything. He stood there, looked carefully at what was in front of him, and he understood it. That's the part that matters most to me, not the ending, but that quiet moment of seeing clearly when everyone else had stopped looking. I think about the choices Nathan made that most people wouldn't notice. He could have walked away. He had every practical reason to. Nobody had asked him. Nobody would have blamed him. He was sleeping in a Civic with a cracked backpack strap and a prepaid phone, and the world had given him a fairly clear signal about what it thought his opinion was worth. But he went to that front desk anyway. He spoke precisely. He didn't soften what he knew or inflate it. He just said what he saw. That kind of honesty, the kind that doesn't perform and doesn't apologize, is rarer than most people admit. And then there was Claude. I don't think Claude was a bad person, exactly. I think he was someone who had confused his credentials with his understanding. And that's a confusion most of us make at some point. The hard thing about expertise is that it can become a wall as easily as it can become a door. Claude had stopped questioning what he knew, and that closed something in him. When Nathan sat down at that terminal, Claude didn't see a solution. He saw a threat. That's what happens when identity gets tangled up with being right. What Nathan had, and what Claude had, somewhere along the way lost, was the willingness to keep asking, to look at a problem fresh, even when it's inconvenient, even when your backpack is splitting and your car is your address, and the room is full of people smiling at you like you're a punchline. That takes something, not bravado, something quieter and harder, a kind of inner steadiness that doesn't depend on the room agreeing with you first. I think that's the real thing this story is about. Not the conveyor system. Not the money, though the money was fair and earned. And I'm glad Nathan asked for what he deserved. It's about what carried Nathan through the months, when none of it had paid off yet. He kept his knowledge sharp. He kept his integrity intact. And he kept showing up, to the parking lot, to the fence, to the front desk, to that terminal, without anyone's permission. Those 3 things together are what turn a long shot into an outcome. Not luck, not connections, not the right outfit or the right address. Just a person who knew something real, who stayed honest about it, and who refused to stop. The fence is still there, in one form or another, for most of us. The question is whether we keep watching from outside it, or whether we walk up and say what we see.